In HitFilm 3 Pro we've upgraded our 3D compositing engine to be even more amazing. We're calling it the Unified 3D Space, and it transforms the way you work with particles, 3D models and other 3D layers. I'm Simon Jones from HitFilm.com, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you exactly why it's so useful. Take this example where we have a mock-up of a spaceship with two jet thrusters. It looks okay until we move the camera around to the other side. And suddenly you can see that the particles and the 3D object aren't being rendered correctly relevant to each layer's 3D position. This rendering technique is sometimes called 2.5D. So while all the separate elements are created in 3D, so the spaceship and the jet thrusters, they're not interacting with each other. In HitFilm you can choose which way you want to work, as they both have their benefits. In this tutorial we'll be focusing on the unified 3D space. So, in this example, watch as I switch the objects to the 3D unrolled mode. As I orbit the camera around, you can see that the jets and spaceship are now rendered correctly relative to each other. Let's take a closer look at this shot of an aeroplane flying through clouds. There's a few things to note. Check out the trails pluming off of the wingtips, and of course the clouds enveloping the aeroplane on all sides. As the camera does a big move around the aeroplane, the clouds and the wing trails all render correctly in 3D space relative to the aeroplane and each other. There's no masking or layering tricks involved here, it's just HitFilm 3 Pro's unified 3D space doing its thing. Let's pull the shot apart. First up, to avoid any confusion with HitFilm's plane layers, I'm going to refer to the model throughout this video as the model or the aeroplane or something like that, just so you always know exactly what I'm talking about. So on top of everything we've got a grade layer, with cine style providing the overall look, curves adding some additional contrast, and film grain helping to lessen that perfectly clean CG kind of feel. The clouds are a single particle simulator containing two separate emitters, one for the higher clouds and one for the lower. If I switch to the perspective view you can see this more clearly. So I split the clouds into two parts so that I could create a clear tunnel for the aeroplane to fly through. This creates the appearance of a dense cloudscape while still keeping the aeroplane clearly visible. I didn't want it to just disappear into the cloud. There's a separate particle simulator for the wing trails. These are very simple particle trails linked to a couple of 3D points which are positioned on the wingtips. Because these points are parented to the aeroplane, as the aeroplane moves, the points stay locked on. Nice and easy, but it really adds to the overall sense of movement. The background is a single wraparound image, which has been turned into a 3D environment using the Environment Map Viewer effect. As the camera pivots around in the scene, the background updates automatically. As you can see, it's actually a mirrored image, so there's no ground plane, but for the requirements of the shot, that didn't really matter, as the background is largely obscured by the clouds. The aeroplane itself is a 3D model from Video Copilot's awesome Jet Strike pack. As you can see, it's properly shadow casting and is being partially lit by the same wraparound environment image I'm using as a background. This provides not only some diffuse lighting but also a subtle reflection. With the environment map turned off, you can see that the aeroplane loses some of that blue tinting, not to mention the reflection. There's only actually one real light in the scene, a directional light positioned above and in front of the aeroplane. So in terms of lighting, this is actually a really simple scene, despite the fairly realistic end result. The camera move uses some interesting techniques. In perspective mode you can see more of what's going on. So the aeroplane is animated on a simple forward trajectory. Parented to the aeroplane is a point layer, and parented to the point layer is the camera. The camera layer doesn't actually have any animation at all. It's all done through the point, which is animated to rotate. As the point rotates, the camera then moves in relation to it. The result is a camera which pivots around the airplane while perfectly keeping pace with it. Setting up rigs like this really is the key to working efficiently in 3D shots. This rig is actually very simple, but to create a similar camera move without using this kind of setup would be very tricky indeed. Okay, so now that we've reverse engineered the shot, let's have a go at creating it from scratch. So first up, you need a 3D model of a flying vehicle. Now this aeroplane was from Video Copilot's Jet Strike pack, like I mentioned. But if you're looking for free models, there's a ton of resources online. Foundation3D.net is worth a visit if you're looking for sci-fi models. Otherwise, just try Googling for free 3D models. There's a ton of stuff out there. The concepts in this tutorial apply to any 3D model, so don't feel you need to be using premium models to follow along. But of course, you do tend to get what you pay for. You could even make your own model in Blender or Cinema 4D or Studio Max if you have those 3D modeling skills. When you import a model using the 3D model option from the import menu, the primary thing to do is check any animation groups you want, because you can only do this during the import stage. Don't go changing your mind later on. Remember that this requires the model to have been built properly with groups already set up. This particular model has a ton of groups, but the only ones I actually need for this shot are the 4 propellers. So I'll go through and find those and tick each one of them. Over in the Materials tab, I'll set up the body to have some diffuse and specular reflectivity. This means the material is ready to be used in conjunction with an environment map. I also tend to adjust the specular colour so that it better reflects the ambient lighting in whatever background I use. The only other change I did in this case was to whack up the specular reflectivity for the windshield material, so that it's nice and reflective, just like you'd expect from glass. Remember that materials can be adjusted at a later stage. You can do it at any point just by opening the model's properties from the media panel, so you don't have to get it all 100% perfectly set up right now. Okay, so that 3D model is now available in the media panel to be used just like any other asset, like a video or an image. I'm going to create a new composite shot at 2K to work in. You'll note I've customised my workspace a little. I tend to work with an altered version of the default compositing setup. If you want to get the same layout, just head up to the Workspaces menu and choose Compositing. Then I'll just drag this whole container, moving it over the drop zone here. Once I let go, it's positioned down to the bottom left. You can create your own layouts for your workspace and save them if you want. So once you're used to the program, just set up your interface how you like it, and then you can carry on from there. Okay, so straight up I'll drag the 3D model from the media panel over to the timeline. It's positioned in the centre. You'll note that the aeroplane is in 2D mode currently, as shown by the square icon down here. This is another new feature in HitFilm 3 Pro. While this tutorial is all about the unified 3D space, you don't have to work that way. We'll be covering the alternatives in separate tutorials. So let's switch this 3D model to 3D unrolled. This means it's now in the unified 3D space and will interact with any other 3D layers which are also set to 3D unrolled. You can see this has also automatically added a 3D camera to the scene. The first thing I'm going to do is get my camera into its starting position. To do this, I'm going to orbit the camera around the airplane. You can activate the orbit button to do this, but a far quicker way is to hold down the control key and right-click on the viewer. The camera will then orbit around wherever you click. So I'll control right-click on the nose of the aeroplane and orbit my camera around to about here. Doesn't really matter, you just go for something that you think looks good. I'm going to push in a bit closer using the dolly controls at the top right of the viewer and make a few additional tweaks to get the exact angle that I'm after. Then in the camera's lens properties, I'm going to increase the zoom so that we have a slightly more telephoto look, just like you might get if you were actually filming a plane from another plane. Alright, it's now time to add a new point layer from the New Layer menu on the timeline. This I'm going to switch to 3D. You can see it's now positioned just above the aeroplane. I'm going to parent it to the aeroplane using the Link menu. At this stage, it's a good idea to start naming layers so we don't get confused, so I'm going to call this Camera Pivot. I can now parent the camera layer to the camera pivot, and this is where things get interesting, as I can now animate the point and the camera will be directly affected, orbiting around the aeroplane. So at the start of the shot, I'll activate keyframing for the point's rotation properties, then I'll scoot forwards and adjust the rotation to the camera's finishing position. It's up to you what you actually go for. On the timeline, I'll now grab those latter keyframes and drag them to the end of the timeline, creating a slower movement. Okay, let's move the aeroplane. I'll switch the viewer to the top view for this. In the model's world transform properties, I'll now activate the position keyframing and move the plane back a bit. Note how the camera stays locked in place. I'll now move forwards in the timeline and then shift the aeroplane. You can do more if you want, maybe animating some rotation so that the aeroplane looks like it's banking. It's entirely up to you. Everything is a bit abstract at the moment because there's no reference points, so let's put in a background. I'm using an environment map from the Jetstrike pack, but you can find some really good examples to try out if you Google for something like panoramic aerial photography. So I've dropped my 4K environment map onto the timeline just below the aeroplane layer. This environment map will remain as a 2D layer in the composite, sitting below everything else. We just want it to be the background. It's considerably larger than our 2K frame, so I'll just zoom out in the viewer, select the layer and then drag its edges to shrink it down. You You can hold Shift to maintain the aspect ratio as you do that. Right now it's just a still image stuck in the background. All I need to do to convert this into a wraparound environment is drag on the environment map viewer effect. In the controls panel, I'll then update the effects scale ratio to 2 so that it's fully wrapped on a sphere around the camera. So now if I move around the timeline, you can see that we suddenly have a convincing context to what this aeroplane is doing as the environment map viewer effect interacts with the camera. The aeroplane currently has no lighting, so let's fix that. In the aeroplane's layer material properties, I'll set the environment map to layer and then select our background layer. Instantly the aeroplane takes on the lighting ambience and reflection of the background. You'll remember that I set that up earlier when importing the 3D model. If you want to do any further tweaks, just go into the model's properties from the media panel and change it however you want. Our lighting is still pretty flat, and that's because we don't actually have any 3D lights yet. So it's time to change that by going back to the new layer menu and adding a light. I'll now switch the viewer into a 2-view mode and set the left one to active camera, i.e. what our rendered shot actually looks like, and the right one to perspective mode. I'll also turn off the world grid in the active camera view using the button at the bottom left of the viewer. I can now move the light around easily while still seeing the effect it's having on the model. In the light's properties, I'll change its type to directional, which provides a more even, flatter light, and I'll also turn on cast shadows. I'll go back into the aeroplane's materials and turn on cast shadows there as well. You always have to do that. If you've got light casting shadows, you need to make sure that the objects you want to cast shadows also have it turned on in materials. Otherwise, nothing's going to happen. In the perspective view, I'll switch the align tool to world so that the light's transform widget corresponds to the world, and will position the light appropriately just by dragging the widget around. I want to have some shadowing to bring out the detail on the model. I'm also going to slightly soften the shadow's edge by changing the light's shadow diffusion property. This just gives it a softer edge. Okay, I'll now switch back to the single active camera view. You can see that we've got a good looking aeroplane. We've been asked a lot about how to animate individual parts of 3D models, so let's take a look at that by animating those propellers. In the 3D model layer's properties, you'll find a group called models. This can actually contain multiple 3D models, as a 3D model layer on the timeline can contain multiple models. In this case, we've just got one, the aeroplane. So opening that up reveals the 4 propellers. Remember that I set those up as groups when importing the model, which is why they're showing up here as separate groups. The transform controls for model groups is the same as transforming anything else in HitFilm, so you can do whatever you want with the animation. I'm going to animate the propeller to rotate 10 times throughout the shot, which is probably highly unrealistic, but as long as it looks good. Anyway, if you want to do something more realistic, you can go and Wikipedia exactly how fast a propeller is supposed to turn. So at this point, you probably want to turn on motion blur, so that any animation you're adding looks more convincing. And I'm going to skip forwards to having animated all 4 propellers, because it's basically the same technique throughout. Right, this shot is actually coming together nicely, but it's time to add some clouds. I've actually included a preset of the particle clouds I created, so let's use that to get started. If you've downloaded the project files of this tutorial, you'll find the preset file in the zip called Cloud Volume. To add the preset to your library, simply right-click the effects panel and choose Import Preset. Search for Cloud Volume in the effects panel and it will show up in the list. All you need to do now is drop it from the effects panel onto your timeline. It will drop into place around the aeroplane. Because both the aeroplane and the cloud particles are set to be 3D unrolled, it means they're both interacting in the same 3D space. You can move the camera anywhere you like, and the clouds will be rendered in front or behind the aeroplane as required. Because we've already keyframed our animation, you can see that immediately for yourself by moving the playhead around and causing the camera to animate. Switching to the top view, you'll see that the cloud volume preset actually generates a long cube which the aeroplane and camera are flying through. This serves to illustrate just how the design of a visual effects shot is entirely dependent on the needs of the shot and/or sequence. There's no need to simulate an entire cloudscape over several kilometres for this particular shot, because it's all very localised. Even within this kind of setup, you still get a lot of freedom. Try adding another camera and doing a different move, perhaps looking down on the aeroplane from above and gradually pushing in closer or zooming in. You can of course go in and customise the particle clouds. Try going into the particle system and adjusting the number of particles per second to create denser or sparser clouds, or changing the textures to create vastly different looks. Everything is fully customizable in HitFilm, and we've done a load of particle simulator tutorials already, which are well worth checking out for more information. The last visual effects element is to get the vapor trails onto those wingtips. To do this, we first want to define the position of those wingtips so that HitFilm knows where they are. For this, we'll create some more point layers. So from the new layer menu, select point. This creates the new layer, which I'm now going to change to 3D. We need this to be locked onto the moving aeroplane, just like we did earlier. So I'll parent the point to the aeroplane. Now, here's a quick trick. When you parent something, you change its relative transform properties. By default, a layer's transform is relative to the scene itself. So if your object is at 0, 0, 0, that means it'll be right in the middle of the scene. But once you parent it to something else, it's then relative to that parent layer. After parenting, the child will automatically remain in its original position, with its transform updated accordingly. But that means I can now simply reset the transform, zeroing everything out, and the point will be repositioned right onto the middle of the aeroplane, no matter where it is currently, and that's because the aeroplane is now the relative center of this object. If I now switch to the front view, I can simply slide the point along the wing until it's in the right place. I'll also switch to the top view to move it to the back of the wing. Once that's in place, I can duplicate that point layer, either from the layers menu or using the Ctrl-D shortcut, and then slide that duplicate back along the plane to the other wing. And we're done. Although it's a good idea at this point to rename your point layers so that you don't get them confused. Left wingtip and right wingtip seems to work for me. I'll add a brand new particle simulator layer for the vapor trails, just to keep things neat. I'll switch this new particle layer to 3D unrolled, so that it then becomes part of the 3D unified space. In the emitter shape properties, I'm going to link it up to the left wingtip. I'll leave it as a point shape because we just want the trail coming from a single location. I'll set the texture in the particle system's appearance to smoke thickness 4. The specific texture isn't massively important. The main thing is that you want something soft and dense, but it's going to be so small that the exact detail of the texture won't be seen. In movement, I'm going to drop the speed down to 0. This means the particles will stay exactly where they first appear. The lifetime I'll increase to 5 seconds, and I'll reduce the scale right down to 2%. So basically, it's very small and it only lasts for 5 seconds. As I move the playhead, you can see the trail being generated. The particles per second will need to be adjusted so the trail doesn't have any gaps in it. About 200 seems to be working for this shot. Now, rather than having a line like this which just suddenly stops after 5 seconds, let's adjust the particle system's lifetime properties. Lifetime has its own panel, which displays the currently selected particle system. You might find it easier to move the lifetime panel so that you can see the controls and lifetime at the same time. The lifetime panel affects the behavior of particles over the course of their entire lifetime. So there's two properties we want to adjust. First up, there's the alpha, so that the particles gradually fade out as they get older. Alpha basically controls the transparency. To do this, change the type to gradient and move the white tab to the far left. Then click on the far right of the bar to add a new tab and drop the color back down to black. This means the particles will gradually fade away over those 5 seconds of their life. In the scale lifetime, we'll create a custom graph, again by adding 2 points. On the left, I'll add a point at 0% life and 100% scale. This means the particles will start off at full size as determined by the scale property in the movement section, which we set earlier. I'll then add another point on the graph at the end, setting it to 100% life, i.e. right at the end of the particle's lifetime, and move the scale down to 0%. This means the particles will gradually get smaller as they get older until they disappear. With these two lifetime properties combining, the particles now fade out and get smaller as they get older. This creates the appearance of the vapor trail fading and thinning as it gets further from the wingtips. Because the vapor trails are being created by the movement of the aeroplane itself, no matter what your plane does, the trails will automatically and procedurally update, even if you change the rotation of the aeroplane to do crazy rolls and loops at a later stage in your project. The trails really help to give the audience extra visual information about how the aeroplane is moving through space. And that's pretty much all it takes to put together a shot like this. It's perfect for establishing an aircraft before switching to an interior set, whether you're talking about a fighter jet, a commercial airliner, or something fancy like the bus from Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Whether you're working on visual effect shots, titles, or motion graphics, the 3D unified space makes your projects faster and easier to work on, and you can be sure we'll be covering other examples throughout 2015. Do let us know if you have any questions, and as always, many thanks for watching. I'm Simon Jones from HitFilm.com, and we'll see you on the next video.